The voice inside of your heart and your head, you know it. Talk you through all these days ahead. Hey everyone, thank you so much for clicking on this video. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Keynote. Keynote is the bestest friendship accessory ever, coming soon. I'd love for you to leave a comment below about what you think about this young woman's story you'll hear today. She is on the autism spectrum, and she talks about how she got herself to start speaking after a period of not speaking to anyone. Enjoy the video.
Like when I had selective mutism in middle school, at the time I thought, well, like this basically controls and dominates my life. But and it controls my social situation, it controls everything. Um it ended up becoming, I mean, we haven't really shot the film yet, but so far it's been a fairly successful screenplay. So in the end, like sometimes things do happen for a reason.
Hello, my name is Gena Sims. I am the founder of the Autism Theater Project, and today I'm speaking with Steffi Zachariadis. She is a writer and has great aspirations for what she can contribute to the film, video game, TV media industries. So, Steffi, tell us a little bit about you.
My name is Stephanie. I'm currently 22 years old, which just got out of college, but yeah, currently I work as a quest designer. Um, so yeah, all of my like opinions and thoughts and everything are my own, not represented by my employer or anything. So yeah, I currently work as a quest designer for Bethesda Game Studios, and I started out sort of like doing that as a hobby and it ended up turning into like a career. And prior to that, I actually went to NYU, New York University, for film and television. Ended up graduating this May.
So, when did you decide that you wanted to become a writer?
Initially, when I was probably like around like 3 years old, and I could sort of like write and had like the alphabet sort of down in my mind, I started writing these little short stories. I would illustrate them as well. I was never a good artist, but I tried. And I would try to like write all these little stories. And then as I got older, I actually was pretty far behind in school initially. I actually was almost held back in kindergarten for because I actually was just failing all the tests to progress to the next grade. And then for some reason something sort of snapped when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I suddenly could read like faster than anyone in my grade and could spell any word, and suddenly my writing quality just jumped, and they had me tested and found that I was writing and reading at a high school level when I was 7 or 8 years old. And then ever since then, like all of my teachers and like everyone was always telling me like you have to be a writer, you have to do this. And at the time I just kind of went with it because I thought, well, that's what everyone says I have to do. Um, but when I was a kid, I always used to think about, doing a more visual medium like film or video games. That was what I always wanted to write for.
That's really interesting. And that just goes to show that how kids do in those early years doesn't necessarily even predict how they're going to do throughout elementary school, because we just don't know what the future holds for kids. We don't know when they're going to have those breakthroughs.
I totally agree with that because I feel like you kind of get like pigeonholed into this idea of like who you're supposed to be as soon as you start school. And that's rarely ever the case because your condition does change as you get older. And you kind of are constantly evolving, and sometimes when you're stuck in the same place with the same people who they still have that first impression of you, it actually prevents you from changing because you feel like you can't break out of that image you created for yourself.
Moving into middle and high school, what challenges did you face as a teenager?
So, I always, starting from when I was like in elementary school, I always had a really hard time socially. It was just right off the bat, like I could never really do well with other kids. One of my earliest memories is like, despite the fact that people had tried to befriend me, like I would go outside with like during recess or something, and I would just sit on like a bench and like watch everyone else play because I for some reason didn't want to engage with them. I just kind of watched them do whatever they wanted to do. And, obviously teachers would encourage me, like, go out there and, interact. But for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to. And that sort of persisted. I didn't have normal reactions to when people would talk to me. Like, the instant someone would try to like say something to me, I'd have like an emotional breakdown. Like, I just didn't. This was when I was young, but it was just it. And because of that, it made it really difficult for me to form friendships and relationships, and I couldn't control it. And everyone thought I was doing it on purpose, and they didn't realize that it was like not something that was within my control. And when I was in middle school, when I was 12, and I think I was in seventh grade when this started, um, I basically just stopped talking to people at all. I just decided to myself that I wasn't going to say things. In terms of everyone in my life, I could probably count on one hand the amount of people I spoke to. And if in a case where I had to give a response to like a teacher, I would give like the most basic response, like thank you or um, please or something. But I didn't actually say anything more than that. And actually, because I didn't use my voice very often, my voice would actually get hoarse from disuse. So that actually made it a bit embarrassing to even like try to speak. So that just discouraged me from doing it more. I do wonder like why that started, but I think part of it was like a defense mechanism because I had learned not to speak because I thought, well, if I don't speak, I'm adding less fuel to the fire and that gives people less reason to lash out at me. I think that may have been part of the reason why I became that way, and it persisted for about 2 years. Um, and I think had I stayed in the place I was, it would have lasted much longer, possibly been permanent.
It's interesting how your body could create that sort of defense mechanism and decide, oh, it's safer for us not to speak.
It's kind of like that, yeah. And sometimes it's due to anxiety, and other times just due to like you just can't get it out. It's hard to explain because I just felt like I couldn't say anything, and the worst thing someone could have done is like force me to speak because I had a lot of times like teachers had like good intentions. They wanted me to like I guess coming out of my shell was probably the wrong word because it wasn't even a matter of shyness. It was a matter of just not speaking. But they wanted me to basically contribute to speak to um I guess to be normal, but it wasn't working. Um I was really struggling, and there were teachers who like tried to help me because I don't know, back when I was growing up, there wasn't really like a strong support for children who had difficulties in school unless you were violent or had a very glaring issue. No one would really pay attention to it. So I had teachers try to work with me and try to like speak to me like privately and try to like find out what was wrong with me. And that was mostly because of my writing abilities that they were kind of had their interest peaked where they were wondering like why I could do this thing, but at the same time, like I wasn't speaking to people. It was just the combination of the two made them really interested in like my condition, I suppose. And um I appreciate it, but it was also like a little overwhelming because it was like when you have that, it's like the last thing you want is all the attention.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I guess the best way I could describe it is it is like a block that prevents you from doing so. And it's a little strange because I didn't have something like stage fright. Like I could get up on stage and perform no problem. But if you told me to just speak to someone normally, I would not be able to do that at that time.
That's interesting. Well, how did you overcome that? Because now you're clearly very articulate and seem pretty comfortable.
I believe I was almost 15 when I started to speak um again normally. So the reason I believe that it happened, and I can't be 100% sure because these are all like very sort of in the air things. I don't understand why I started in the first place, so it's hard to understand why I stopped, but I had moved in my last year of middle school, but because I had already started, they let me finish my last year at my old school. but I had moved to the other side of the city I grew up in. And um, basically, I started a new high school that had 2,500 students, and I probably knew maybe like 5 to 10 people, and I didn't even see those 5 to 10 people because it was just such a big school. So I had a completely fresh start, and no one knew who I was. No one knew that I didn't talk. No one knew about all my problems when I was young. I was I had the ability to start over. And I think something about that really encouraged me to just start talking, because I guess I thought like there is a chance that I'm, could succeed in this. And even today I still have like issues with it if people try to speak to me sometimes, like in a formal environment. Like I can't, it's hard for me to bring myself to say things more than just like polite, generic words like, thank you or you're welcome or excuse me, stuff like that. Like my vocabulary can be very like limited when I feel under pressure.
I would love for you to talk about your new film coming up and how your experience in middle school inspired that film.
Sure. So, in NYU, we have like this final senior year project called our capstone, and it's kind of like the culmination of like everything you've learned as a film major, and you work on it. Like your crew is comprised of everyone else who's basically been, going through school with you. And so you work with other NYU students, and you basically make this like short 15-minute film that's like the most important film you'll make basically in undergraduate film school. So for a long time I debated what I was going to do mine about. And then finally, it came to me because I actually thought back to what my personal essay was to get into college. And I thought, why don't I make that into a film? And that ended up being Mute, which is my film. It's basically about a 14-year-old girl who has autism, and she also has selective mutism. So basically, she can't psychologically bring herself to speak. And then she happens to enter into a friendship in a rather unlikely way with the goth school outcast who has like violent tendencies and like doesn't like get along with other people. And they sort of strike up this unlikely friendship, but her new friend has a secret. And when that secret gets out into the school, the bullying that they both face like skyrockets. And the only person who can stand up for her is our protagonist who can't speak. So it's a matter of like, will she, won't she, and is the only friend she ever had and like this good thing in her life like on the line.
That's so cool. Given that you're talking about also experiencing mutism in your early teens, did you ever have an experience with a friend, something similar along those lines, what you described?
A lot of the film was lifted from my own personal experiences. Um, I would say some of the scenes actually are pretty much like almost exactly like things that happened to me or things that involved me when I was in middle school. And I did have a friend like that when I was in middle school. Obviously, like the usually these events take place over the course of like years, but in the film it's condensed into the span of like a week. But and of course like think some of the things are like, exaggerated because you're trying to basically like convey information that you would have learned about a person in a year into like a 15-minute film. For the most part, it is like reflective of my experiences both like with trying to befriend people with selective mutism, how you interact in school, and also like how one component is like how her teachers treat her, and how her like abilities commingle with the fact she can't speak. Like for example, like you had mentioned earlier that you were working on a project when the characters had, I don't know if it was selective mutism, but she couldn't speak, and she was hearing a voice in her head. My main character Emmy has a similar um quirk where she doesn't hear like an inner monologue or like voices in her head, but she hears like these whispers whenever she writes that are kind of like telling her the words to say. So it's almost like they're feeding her information. So she hears that voice in her head, but it's not like an internal monologue or anything.
That's cool. That's really cool. I think that'd be so cool for high schoolers to see and for teenagers, middle schoolers to see. Is that your target audience with this film?
I would say, yeah, my target audience is kind of like anywhere from preteens up. And I think middle school would be a crucial time to watch it because I think that's the period of time when kids are cruelest to each other. And I think that seeing something like this might kind of make them do a double take and think, well, that quiet kid that I've been bullying for the past year isn't just quiet. And even if they were just quiet, that doesn't excuse the actions.
Do you agree with this quote that I liked in high school? Because I was pretty quiet in high school, which says the quietest people have the loudest minds.
I definitely agree with that because when you're not speaking a lot and you're always observing, you're always thinking and you're creating a lot of thoughts in your head. And I think that your brain is probably more active when you aren't speaking a lot, actually. In my issues, like when I had selective mutism in middle school, at the time I thought, well, like this basically controls and dominates my life. But and it controls my social situation, it controls everything. Um it ended up becoming, I mean, we haven't really shot the film yet, but so far it's been a fairly successful screenplay. So in the end, like sometimes things do happen for a reason.
So, thinking back towards high school, how did you feel about how teens were represented in the media? Do you feel like it was accurate?
No, I don't think that the way teens are represented in the media is like accurate at all. I think it's gotten better. I think like I grew up in the early 2000s and I think that back then in like that and in the 90s like it was the representation of like teenagers was just so off. Like it was also, it's a little jarring because usually, they cast older, so they do like teenagers in movies look way older than actual teenagers. But beyond that, I always thought that they were a little too like mature in a weird way. Like they acted like they were in college basically in high school in movies usually. And beyond that, there's also this like expectation that all teenagers do the same thing, like that they all get into the same trouble, that they all like have the same mannerisms, that they all are moody. And usually when there's like in films when there's this form of like mental illness or something, like it's usually used as like a plot device, which we were always like trained to sort of use like any sort of like physical or mental impediment as like a sort of plot device, like as writers, like this is how you put your character into this impossible situation, you give them a new obstacle to get through. And it that was always considered to be like an obstacle, but it always kind of bothered me that it was always just sort of like a device you use because it's a little more important and intricate than that. It makes life more difficult than just being like, oh, that's just another obstacle.
I feel like we're similar artists in the sense that we both want to show people a more realistic side of what teenagers go through and a more varied side of how teenagers experience the world. Um, and clearly you're doing that with your film Mute. So moving forward, how would you like to see teenagers be represented in film?
I'd love to see more of the awkwardness of teenage years and like the challenges. And whenever I would say challenges, they would immediately default to like very adult situations in teen movies. But a lot of the times, like that's not what teenagers are experiencing. And if they're experiencing something that we consider like adult, it's usually some terrible extenuating circumstance forcing them to grow up too fast, not them making stupid mistakes and having to pay for that. So I would like to see more of that, of someone who's like in an actual bad situation dealing with that while being a teenager, or someone just dealing with like the ups and downs of being a teen and like the awkwardness of it and the regular difficulties they face. So I would like to see like more realism in it, and maybe like having less characters that are just like so cool. Like they'll make a film that's about someone who's a nerd or someone who's like a girl next door and they're like so cool, and it's like, but they wouldn't be. They're just supposed to be like a regular person, and that's just not relatable, because even if you're like one of, you would fall into that like caricature and you're watching the film, you wouldn't relate to that at all, because you're just like, well, they're supposed to be like me, but I don't feel like I relate to their personality at all.
That's awesome. Yeah, but with the voice inside, the web series that we're doing with the Autism Theater Project, that's ultimately what we want to achieve. Uh, be able to represent realistic, real teenagers with, you know, different levels of ability, different conditions, different ways of seeing the world, and see how they realistically actually deal with challenges in their lives. So that's awesome. And you mentioned how people with physical or mental illnesses or difficulties, et cetera, um, how they don't the how they tend to oversimplify the condition and just kind of use the condition as an obstacle, but not really delve into what it's really like to experience that.
Mm-hmm.
How would you like to see films and TV shows in the future better represent what it's like to have those conditions?
I feel like if you're going to give a character a serious condition, that there should be some serious like plot development around it. Like something, a trend that we see so often now, and like, you know, what I guess people consider to be bingeable TV shows like on streaming services and stuff, is that they tend to go pretty slowly, and sometimes there's entire episodes just on like a day in the life of a character, or like on some character development for one of the characters, but the plot doesn't really advance at all. So if you're gonna have episodes like that, that would be a good time to actually like explore a character's difficulty with the disability. Like there should be some sort of like elaboration on it, like how does this affect their life, like what sets them apart from the average person, like what makes them, how does this make them feel, like what are they thinking, like are they used to it, do they accept it, like, you know, those should all be questions that like a writer should be asking.
It's interesting. I see your point. I see your point with that, for sure. And I like how you brought up this idea of maybe the person doesn't even see this condition that they're dealing with as such a negative impediment. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. What is their perspective on their own condition?
Everyone looks at themselves and says like this is a problem. They, some people either have recognized that there could be like pros to their situation, or they just think like, you know, I, this is the way things are, and I can live my life just fine, like with or without it. I think a lot of people assume that because someone has a disability that they have to be like miserable in it, and that's not how it is. Like you live your life with what you've got. I've had friends who have had like severe depression, but who have tried to make the most, like clinical depression, I mean, but have tried to make the most of their life, and who like you will see them and they will be cheerful with you. They'll be like really peppy, and like they'll have like a great time with you, and despite the fact that they're struggling, they still realize like, you know, you've got to live your life, you've got to keep going. So even with like a disorder that causes like actual like mental like strife in your mood, you still can, doesn't mean that you're moody all the time. It doesn't mean that you're always struggling. I think people learn how to live with what they're given.
Cool. Um, so a couple last questions.
Mhm.
What advice do you have for kids who are dealing with selective mutism, or who just don't speak very much?
Well, first, I'd probably say it doesn't mean that there's anything really wrong with you. It just means that it's not, that for some reason you have an impediment that's holding you back, and it's not impossible to get over it. It it feels impossible at the time because you think like, what am I going to do? I would say as much as you can to search for a fresh start, and if you have the opportunity to get one, to absolutely take it, because it makes all of the difference. It can change who you are as a person.
What advice do you have for teens who want to go into the arts?
Focus on hobbies that will open a door for you. It's a matter of just like putting yourself out there and not just expecting to go a traditional avenue, because a lot of people think like, oh, I'll go to college and then I'll apply, maybe do a couple internships, and then I'll end up, making art in some capacity. But in my experience, it doesn't work that way, because in order to get the job you actually want, I think you actually have to go out there and like make something and like make a name for yourself.
Cool. Well, it was great talking to you, Steffi.
Yeah, it was a great interview. Thank you for having me.
No problem.
Listen to your heart. Every day's a brand new start. Make decisions in your life that make great visions come to life. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed listening to Steffi's story, please hit that subscribe button. We have more really cool stories coming for you. Yes, for you on this channel. And I'd also like to thank once again our sponsor, Keynos. Keynos is the bestest friendship accessory ever, coming soon. If you guys want to learn more about us or get involved in what we're doing in any way, you can check us out at www.autismtheaterproject.org. We're also on Facebook and on Instagram. Our handles are Autism Theater Project. Have an awesome rest of your day.